He abandoned me at the hospital, but returned crying when he saw the doctor's report. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway buzzed overhead as I sat alone in the uncomfortable plastic chair, my hands trembling as I held the medical report. Sawyer had left me here 3 hours ago, claiming he had an emergency at work that couldn't wait. But I knew the truth. He just couldn't handle being around me anymore. What he didn't know was that the doctor's report in my hands would change everything. When he finally returned, tears streaming down his face, it was already too late. My name is Giselle, and I need to tell you about the day my world fell apart, and how it led to the most surprising revelation of my life. 6 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I was married to Sawyer Williams, a successful software engineer at a tech startup in Atlanta. We lived in a beautiful house in Buckhead, drove matching luxury cars, and looked like the perfect young black couple living the American dream. But before I continue, have you subscribed yet? Please click that button to subscribe for more amazing stories, and mark the register by commenting which country you're watching from. Today's shout out goes to Alice Nugi. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it well, watching from Kenya. Thank you for watching and commenting. Now buckle up, because this story, it's mine. I worked as a pediatric nurse at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and I loved every minute of it. There's something special about helping kids heal, about being there for families during their most vulnerable moments. My colleagues often said I had a gift for connecting with kids, especially those who were scared or in pain. Sawyer and I had met 5 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday party. He was charming, ambitious, and had this way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the room. He'd grown up in a middle-class family in Stone Mountain, worked his way through Georgia Tech, and landed a 6-figure job straight out of college. When we got married 2 years ago, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Sawyer was everything I had ever wanted. Smart, successful, and seemingly devoted to our future together. He'd talk about the house we'd buy, the trips we'd take, the life we'd build. But somewhere along the way, things started to change. It began with small comments about my appearance. "Giselle, maybe you should hit the gym more often," he'd say while looking at his phone. "I'm just looking out for your health." When I'd come home exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, he'd sigh and say, "You look tired all the time lately. It's not very attractive." Then came the comments about my job. "You know, babe, nursing is great and all, but it's not exactly prestigious. Maybe you should consider going back to school, get your nurse practitioner degree, or something more impressive." I tried to brush it off at first. I told myself he was just being honest, that he wanted me to reach my full potential. But gradually, his words began to chip away at my confidence. The worst part was how he'd act around his colleagues and friends. At company parties, he'd introduce me as just a nurse with this apologetic smile, as if he was embarrassed by what I did for a living. When I tried to contribute to conversations, he'd cut me off or change the subject. "Giselle doesn't really understand tech stuff," he'd say with a laugh. "She's more of a people person." I started to feel invisible in my own marriage. The man who once couldn't get enough of me now seemed annoyed by my very presence. Our conversations became shorter, our intimate moments less frequent, and I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. About 4 months ago, I started experiencing symptoms that I initially dismissed as stress from work. I'd been pulling extra shifts to help cover for a colleague who was on maternity leave, and I figured my body was just tired. It started with headaches, sharp, stabbing pains that would come out of nowhere and leave me dizzy. Then came the nausea, so severe that I'd have to excuse myself from patient rooms to collect myself in the bathroom. "You're probably just overworked," Sawyer said, dismissively when I mentioned it. "Maybe you should take some time off." but I couldn't take time off. My unit was understaffed and the children needed me. I powered through, taking over-the-counter pain relievers and trying to ignore the growing list of symptoms. The fatigue was overwhelming. I'd come home from work and collapse on the couch, unable to muster the energy to cook dinner or even hold a conversation. Sawyer's response was predictable. "You're always tired, Giselle. It's like living with a zombie. Maybe you should see someone about this." The vision problem started next. I'd be looking at a patient's chart and suddenly the words would blur together. During one particularly scary episode, I lost vision in my left eye for about 10 minutes. I managed to get through my shift, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I made an appointment with my primary care physician, Dr. Catherine Rivers, a woman I'd known since my residency days. She was thorough, compassionate, and never made me feel like I was overreacting. "Giselle, I want to run some tests," she said after examining me. "These symptoms, taken together, are concerning. I want to rule out some things." "What kind of things?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "Let's get the tests done first. No point in worrying until we have more information." But I was already worrying. As a nurse, I'd seen enough patients to know that my combination of symptoms could point to something serious. The headaches, the vision problems, the fatigue, they painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. The tests Dr. Rivers ordered required a brief hospital stay for monitoring. I needed an MRI with contrast, several blood tests, and a lumbar puncture. It wasn't going to be pleasant, but I knew it was necessary. I told Sawyer about the appointment on a Tuesday evening. He was sitting at his computer working on some project that seemed to consume all his attention lately. "I need to go to the hospital Thursday for some tests," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Dr. Rivers wants to run some diagnostics." He didn't look up from his screen. "What kind of tests?" "MRI, blood work, maybe a spinal tap. I'll probably need to stay overnight for observation." That got his attention. He turned around, and I saw something in his expression I couldn't quite read. "Overnight? For what?" "The symptoms I've been having, the headaches, vision problems, fatigue. She wants to rule out some conditions." Sawyer was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of conditions?" I hesitated. I didn't want to say the words out loud as if speaking them might make them real. She didn't want to speculate, that's why we need the tests. "Right," he said, turning back to his computer. "Well, let me know what you find out." That was it. No offer to come with me, no questions about what I might be facing, no comfort or reassurance. Just, "Let me know what you find out." Like I was reporting on a work meeting. Thursday morning came and I drove myself to the hospital. I'd asked Sawyer if he wanted to come with me, but he said he had an important presentation at work. I told him it was fine, that I was a nurse and I could handle being in a hospital alone. But being a patient is different than being a nurse. When they wheeled me into the MRI machine, I felt claustrophobic and scared. When they did the lumbar puncture, I found myself wishing I had someone there to hold my hand. I texted Sawyer updates throughout the day, but his responses were brief and distracted. "Okay. Hope it goes well. Talk later." It was like he was already emotionally checking out of whatever this might be. The worst part was the waiting. After all the tests were done, I had to wait for the results. I was lying in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling when I heard familiar voices in the hallway. "Giselle, oh my God, what are you doing here?" It was my colleague, Maria, one of the nurses from my unit. She rushed into the room, her face full of concern. "I'm having some tests done," I said, trying to smile. "Nothing too serious, I hope." "Girl, why didn't you tell us? We would have been here with you. Where's Sawyer?" I felt my throat tighten. He had to work. You know how it is. Maria's expression changed. She'd been married for 15 years and had never missed a single one of her husband's medical appointments. He couldn't get the day off for this? It's fine, I said quickly. Really, I'm used to hospitals. But Maria wasn't buying it. Giselle, honey, being used to hospitals doesn't mean you should go through medical tests alone. That's what spouses are for. After she left, I lay there thinking about what she had said. When had I become so accepting of being alone in the important moments? When had I stopped expecting support from the man who was supposed to be my partner? The next morning, Dr. Rivers came to see me with a serious expression. She sat down beside my bed, which I knew was never a good sign. Giselle, I need to talk to you about your test results. I've asked your husband to come in so we can discuss this together. My heart sunk. Is it that bad? I think it's important that you have support for this conversation. When will Sawyer be here? I checked my phone. I'd texted him an hour ago that Dr. Rivers wanted to meet with both of us, but he hadn't responded. He should be here soon, I lied. We waited. And waited. After 45 minutes, Dr. Rivers gently suggested that we proceed without him. I can explain everything to him later, she said kindly, but you need to know what we're dealing with. Just as she was about to speak, Sawyer rushed into the room looking harried and annoyed. Sorry, I'm late, he said, not looking at me. Traffic was terrible and I had this meeting that ran long. Dr. Rivers introduced herself and began explaining the situation. As she spoke, I watched Sawyer's face change. The initial annoyance gave way to something else. Fear, maybe, or panic. So, what you're telling me is that this could be serious, he interrupted. We need to run more tests to be certain, but yes, we're looking at some concerning possibilities. Giselle will need ongoing monitoring and possibly treatment. Treatment? Sawyer's voice was sharp. What kind of treatment? Dr. Rivers explained the next steps, the additional tests that would be needed, the possibility of medication, the need for regular follow-ups. With each word, I could see Sawyer retreating further into himself. I need some air, he said suddenly, standing up. This is a lot to process. He left the room, and I apologized to Dr. Rivers for his behavior. She was understanding, explaining that people react differently to medical news, that it might take time for him to adjust. But I knew better. I could see in his eyes that he was already planning his escape. After Dr. Rivers left, I waited for Sawyer to come back. An hour passed, then 2. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted him asking where he was, but got no response. Finally, a nurse came to check on me. Honey, your husband asked me to give you this. She handed me a note scrawled on a piece of paper. Emergency at work. Had to leave. We'll call you later. S. I stared at the note, feeling a mix of hurt and anger that I'd never experienced before. He had left me alone in a hospital room, having just received potentially life-changing medical news because of a work emergency. But deep down, I knew it wasn't really about work. It was about him not being able to handle the possibility that his wife might be sick, that he might have to be a caregiver instead of just a husband. I spent the rest of the day alone, processing what Dr. Rivers had told me, trying to understand what the future might hold. When I was finally discharged the next morning, I took a cab home. Sawyer was in his home office when I walked in, and he barely looked up from his computer. How'd it go? He asked as if he hadn't been there for the most important part. You were there, Sawyer. You heard what the doctor said. Right, but what's the plan now? I sat down across from him, studying his face. The plan is more tests, possibly treatment, and definitely some lifestyle changes. I'm gonna need support. He nodded absently, already turning back to his screen. Sure, whatever you need. But I could tell he didn't mean it. In his mind, he was already gone. Over the next few weeks, Sawyer's behavior became increasingly distant. He'd come home later and later, claiming he had projects to finish or networking events to attend. When I try to talk to him about my medical situation, he'd change the subject or suddenly remember something urgent he needed to do. I can't keep taking off work, he said one evening when I asked him to come to an important follow-up appointment. My boss is already asking questions about my availability. Your wife is potentially facing a serious medical condition. Doesn't that matter more than your boss's opinion? Of course it matters, but I have responsibilities. We have bills to pay, a mortgage, car payments. Someone has to keep earning money. It was a reasonable argument on the surface, but I knew it was just an excuse. Sawyer was running away from the possibility that our perfect life might become complicated. The worst part was how he started treating me at home. He'd flinch when I touched him as if I was contagious. He'd make comments about how I looked tired or sick as if my appearance was somehow offensive to him. Maybe you should take some time off work, he suggested one morning. Until you figure out what's going on with your health. I can't afford to take time off work. And besides, work is one of the few things that still makes me feel normal. But what if you're contagious? What if you give something to the kids? I stared at him in disbelief. Sawyer, the doctors don't think it's contagious. You were in the room when they explained this. I know, but still, maybe it's better to be safe. That's when I realized he wasn't just running away from my illness. He was running away from me. In his mind, I had become damaged goods, a burden he didn't want to carry. I started staying later at work, partly because I loved my job and partly because I didn't want to go home to a husband who could barely look at me. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but I wasn't ready to talk about what was happening at home. You doing okay, Giselle? Asked one of the doctors I worked closely with. You seem different lately. Gabriel was one of the kindest people I had ever met. He was a pediatric oncologist, soft-spoken, and incredibly skilled with both children and their families. We'd worked together for 3 years, and he'd always been respectful and professional. Thank you, I said, but I wasn't ready to admit that my marriage was falling apart just when I needed support the most. 3 weeks after my initial hospital stay, Dr. Rivers called with news about my test results. Her voice was careful, measured, and I knew immediately that she had answers I might not want to hear. Giselle, I need you to come in as soon as possible, and I really think Sawyer should be with you for this conversation. My heart was pounding when I hung up the phone. This was it, the moment I'd been treading, but also desperately wanting. At least I'd finally know what was wrong with me. I found Sawyer in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich. Dr. Rivers wants to see us both this afternoon. She has my test results. He stopped mid-motion, holding the mayo-covered knife in the air. Today? Yes, today. She says it's important. I watched him struggle with the decision. Part of me wanted to beg him to come, to be the husband I needed him to be, but another part of me was tired of begging for basic human decency. I'll try, he said finally, but I might be a few minutes late. We drove to Dr. Rivers' office in separate cars. I got there first and waited in the parking lot, hoping to see Sawyer's car pull up. When it was time for my appointment, I went in alone. Dr. Rivers was waiting for me in her office, along with a stack of files and what looked like several test results. She stood up when I entered, her expression warm but serious. "Where's Sawyer?" she asked. "He's running late. He said to start without him." She nodded, but I could see the disapproval in her eyes. "Giselle, I want you to know that regardless of what we discuss today, you have options and support. You're not alone in this." "That bad, huh?" "Let's sit down." Dr. Rivers opened the first file and pulled out what looked like brain scans. "Your MRI showed some abnormalities that we need to address. There are lesions in your brain that are consistent with multiple sclerosis." The words hit me like a physical blow. Multiple sclerosis. MS. I'd known it was a possibility, but hearing it confirmed was still shocking. "Are you certain?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We ran several tests to confirm, including the lumbar puncture and additional blood work. The results are consistent with relapsing remitting MS, which is actually the most common form and has the best prognosis." She went on to explain what this meant, the treatment options available, the likelihood of managing the condition successfully, but I was only half listening because I was thinking about Sawyer, about how he was going to react to this news. "So she's gonna be sick," he said bluntly. "She has a medical condition that requires management. With proper care, she can live a completely normal life. But she'll need care, treatment, medication. Yes, like millions of people with chronic conditions. Diabetes, hypertension, thyroid disease. These are all manageable conditions that people live with successfully." Sawyer was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then he asked the question that broke my heart. "Is it progressive? I mean, will she get worse?" Dr. Rivers explained the different types of MS, the treatment options, the generally positive prognosis for my specific type, but I could see that Sawyer wasn't really listening. He was calculating, trying to figure out what this meant for him.